Hi, Frederik. Thanks for joining me. It's great to see you again.
Hello.
Well, I wanted to talk to you a bit about, game strategy, really, in live interpretation and live storytelling, because you've been using, role play, live action, and role playing and games and so on quite a lot when doing live interpretation experiences. And I was wondering if you could tell a bit about what sort of elements from, I guess, especially from role play or from games have you been using when creating engaging visitor experiences, but also can you explain a bit about how they worked?
Yeah. So from gaming, I've been using the most sort of concrete method, I suppose, which is called gameplay loops,
Right.
and it's sort of a very basic but a very core element of game design essentially. And from role playing, and I've been using the idea of just one is having the visitors being characters that works especially well in educational purposes and so on. But the other thing is just the freedom to act and to choose sort of your own approach to the experience, so to speak, which is difficult, but when it works, it works really well.
So it's very character based.
The element from role play, I would say yes, is one is sort of just having from the museum point of view, sort of employing characters, having characters on site, so to speak. But the other thing is definitely, if at all possible, making the guests characters as well. Which again, I've only sort of really managed to do that with educational purposes, but that was also a success, so to speak. At least the students opted into it. They became they were meant to be noblemen, which they did, and they ended up really treating a colleague of mine who was meant to be a peasant who came to ask for help. Essentially, they treated him like dirt, which was great because that meant that they were they were engaging with the experience and they were actively partaking, which was great.
Oh, great. Could you explain a bit about what is game loops?
Yeah, so essentially the theory is that every single game can be broken down into gameplay loops, and basically you divide them into your core gameplay loop or your primary gameplay loop, and then you have your secondary gameplay loop, your tertiary gameplay loop, and essentially you can keep adding on. But for simplicity's sake, you have the three. Now, your core gameplay loop, that is your second-to-second experience, is essentially what you will be experiencing, or what your gamers will be experiencing constantly. And the basic rule, the game design 101, is when you're building something new, always focus on your core gameplay loop. Right. Because it doesn't matter if you have this great story, or you have this really cool twist in the second act, or you have this brilliant mechanic that you're going to introduce about 30 minutes into the game. None of it matters if your second-to-second experience isn't engaging, because the players are never going to, they're just going to stop playing, essentially. Mm. And essentially, I was just listening to a podcast about game development and so on, and it just struck me that this way of looking at it, having your focusing on the second-to-second experience, that is something that maybe museums should be doing more, because at least I find that normally we tend to focus on what we want the guests, what feeling do we want to create in them, or what specific information do we want to convey. But the second-to-second experience, which is essentially walking around the museum, is often something that is not actually thought of as part of it. But anyway, back on track. Yeah, so you have your core gameplay loop or your primary gameplay loop, second-to-second. If we take, let's take something very simple like Super Mario Brothers. I assume that's a reference that will hit home with most people. There you would have the core gameplay loop, would simply be jumping from platform to platform and avoiding to fall down, essentially. That's what you're doing from a second-to-second basis. Your secondary gameplay loop, you can look at it as the minute-to-minute experience, or you can look at it as sort of a why to your first gameplay loop. So why do you do the primary gameplay loop? Well, you do that to achieve the secondary gameplay loop. Mm-hmm. So again, if we hit back to Mario, the secondary gameplay loop would be to complete all the stages, essentially, of the game.
Yes.
Or to complete a stage, essentially. And then you have the tertiary gameplay loop, which is your hour-to-hour experience, or again, you can look at it as a why to the secondary gameplay loop. So essentially, why do you complete the stages? well, you do that to eventually save the princess and complete the game, essentially. And as I said, you can keep on adding layers, but for simplicity's sake, I think just going with these three is the easiest way of looking at it. So essentially, when you create something, if everything is perfect, then you want your core gameplay loop to reinforce your secondary gameplay loop and the other way around. So essentially, the better you do the core gameplay loop, the better you will do the secondary gameplay loop, and then something like a level structure, for instance, which is quite normal, like you gain experience, you go up a level. That means the higher level you get, the second or the primary gameplay loop is going to be easier because you have rose into a higher rank in the secondary gameplay loop, essentially. So that's from the gaming point of view. If that makes sense.
But that also, I guess, that will have an impact on how you plan this, I imagine.
Yes, so that is that's sort of the core, as I said, is to always focus on the primary gameplay loop.
Okay,
so
right.
Every decision you take should be supported by what do you want your players, or in our world, what do you want your guests to experience on a second-to-second basis. So, I mean, the way I have used it so far is to have the primary loop look like, what do I actually want my guests to do on a second-to-second basis? If you take something like a treasure hunt, let's say that's quite easy to understand. Then you will have your guests, their primary loop, their primary goal, what they will constantly be doing is to find the different areas or posts where you have the treasure hunt going on. And then it would be to complete whatever task is necessary to defeat that post, gain whatever you need, and then move on to the next, whether that be an actual challenge or it's just, finding the post and writing down whatever it says on the post. That's your core gameplay loop.
There is an interesting element in that, Frederik, as well, because you mentioned even in a game like Mario, and he's basically jumping from platform to platform, there is an element in using the physical surroundings there as well that you want visitors to feed into, I guess. It's not just about getting into the story and participating in the story, but there is an element of the physical and in getting people to do and to act as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think one of the challenges is exactly getting people to enjoy the experience of just walking around the physical space that is a museum, which is why something like a treasure hunt is a nice platform to start off on, because the experience of looking for something within space. But that also informs some decisions you have to make later on, because let's say that instead of just a sign, you have characters that they have to go out and find, like people in costumes and so on, right? If you want to create this sense that the castle is living and dynamic and so on, it would make sense to just have them freely move about the castle wherever you want to. That's something you quite typically see. But if you go back to the core gameplay loop, if the core element is to find these characters, they need to be findable, so to speak. So you can't have them just move freely about. They need to be within a certain space. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean just one room, but they have to be within a defined area so that if guests get lost, they can be directed to that specific area, saying, oh, you still need to find that guy. Well, he's in that general vicinity. Your secondary gameplay loop, right, would be how they're moving about these characters, but that needs to be informed by your primary gameplay loop. Is the essential idea.
That's a good point. But what you're also doing with this kind of experience is you're essentially putting visitors in control of the outcome, and therefore also to a certain degree in control of the experience. I was wondering what does that mean for visitors? I mean, are they okay with this? Is it a kind of responsibility to put on them a little bit, or how do they feel?
I mean, it is a responsibility. And in my experience, they are more than willing to shoulder this responsibility, but you have to give them the tools to do so. So I think what's very important is from the outline, when they arrive at the museum or when they start on whatever experience you've designed for them, to really clearly describe to them what their role is. The first time I designed something where we did this, the first couple of days we had this very elaborate introduction where we would try to tell this sort of ongoing narrative alongside their experience. And what we discovered quite quickly was that for the introductory part, they needed simple, clear instructions.
Right.
This is your task. how do you accomplish the task? You go out, you find everyone who, like me, is dressed in some sort of older garments, and they will have some sort of task for you. You complete that task, you get your clue, you move on to the next. That is your job. And then it became sort of up to the rest of the characters to tell this narrative that we had planned alongside, because they needed the very clear, simple instruction at the beginning. And when we didn't give them that, they were confused, and then they got frustrated, right? Because then essentially, as you said, we gave them a responsibility, but we didn't equip them to lift the responsibility.
True.
But when it works, my experience is that guests will enjoy the experience based on something else than they normally would. So you give them agency, essentially, right? You give them a reason to walk around the museum.
True.
And what I found was that sort of the mission or the goal became the main driving force, rather than, let's say, a historic interest or something, which was fun to see.
Yeah, that's the best kind of experience, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Can you take into consideration when developing something like this? Can you take, for example, different age groups into consideration? Because I imagine if you have a family with quite young kids, or you have a group of teenagers and so on, the experience will be very different.
Definitely. One of the things that we've done so far is to have to give our reenactors, we present them with sort of an array of different tasks that they can do. And then depending on the group, you spend the first sort of 5 to 10 seconds sort of gauging what level are we at here, what interest level are we at, but also sort of, how old are they, and how much are they engaging with the premise of the experience, right? Are they just walking around, solving tasks, moving on, or are they sort of engaging with the larger narrative and so on? And depending on that, you then have a set of tasks that's sort of more suitable for both age differences and like how much are they engaging with the story and so on. So I'd say that in the design, you just need to vary your possibilities as much as possible.
Yeah, because I was about to say it does require that the concept in itself at its core is quite flexible. From the museum's perspective, because what if, let's say, one of your reenactors are off sick, or there is a kind of missing link?
Yeah.
Does it accommodate for that?
I think that depends on the design, and especially I think it depends on how linear of a structure you have designed,
Right.
And that again that depends also on just the structure of your routes and so on in the museum, like how much freedom do you have, essentially, right? But if you have a very linear structure, then it's harder to have a missing link.
Yeah, true.
So the more open and experience you can make, the more flexible it will get, because essentially what you can do if it's not linear is that whenever someone arrives to, let's say, one character looking for a clue, then you could essentially just have them hand out 2 clues instead. That's again going back to the treasure hunt. But again, the more open it is, the easier it is to remove stuff from the experience without the guest necessarily noticing that something's been removed. Whereas in a linear structure, it gets harder.
It's funny because you're also addressing, I think, a thing that's often a challenge for most heritage sites, not necessarily museums, but heritage sites, like you mentioned, historical castles and historic buildings and houses, which is that of wayfinding. We tend to show visitors exactly where to go and if there's a specific route and so on. But now you're kind of playing a little bit around that by saying, you go and find this. This is a treasure hunt, or this is a game in which you have to go and seek and find for yourself here.
Yeah, actually, we very much on purpose tried to remove all the wayfinding that we had on site to begin with, because the idea was, can we make it challenging but not frustrating?
Yeah.
And what in our case, what ended up happening was the sort of our main courtyard, from where we have sort of different routes that you go into. So you go in one place, you end up back in the courtyard, you go into some place else. And what ended up happening was that the characters we had in the courtyard, they ended up sort of becoming the wayfinding, so that you would find them in the courtyard first, and then you would move into one of our indoor routes. And then when you came back out, then maybe there was a character in the courtyard you hadn't met before, so you could go talk to them. And if not, you would go find one of the characters you've already talked to and you would ask them, so where can I go next? Where can I go to find this clue? And then they would give sort of a vague sort of, oh, you're looking for this? Well, then you should probably go in through that door over there and then see what happens. Which was quite nice. It became sort of this hub area, really, to borrow another gaming term, in the courtyard, where people would constantly return back to. And you had this sort of this very chaotic but fun sort of experience in the courtyard, where guests, depending on how far along in the experience they would sort of cross each other, and they would go. And some people would pick up on the fact that, oh, those guys over there, they have discovered something. Let's just move over to them. What are they doing here? And oh no, we already have that. All right, then we'll move back. Or maybe we'll follow them because they seem to know where they're going and so on. So that's quite fun.
So in a way, visitors were also interacting with each other.
A little, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it became quite quickly. It became apparent that we couldn't do one family at a time. There was simply, we had too many guests essentially. So we ended up doing like groups of 2 or 3 families at a time. And of course, in that case, what is difficult is to make sure that the individual feels heard and seen and so on in this communal experience. But that worked, at least to some degree, I'd say.
But that's interesting, because it also gives you, I guess, an element of control in deciding where you want people to gather socially and where you want these different meeting points set up, essentially. Did you get an impression of how much, when you're so engaged in a game and you want to, you're finding people or finding tasks or something, how much else can visitors take in? Are they aware that they are now in this particular room or in a courtyard, or what happened here from a historical perspective? Or are they so absorbed in the game that that's all they can really take in?
I think they're definitely absorbed in the game. And I think, ideally speaking, you would then make sure to place, let's say, for instance, when we did it, I was playing the Scottish ambassador staying at the castle. You would then, as far as possible, make sure to place him in whatever room he would actually have stayed in, because then the physical space and the game coexists, right? That would, again, I would argue, be use of your secondary gameplay loop, sort of the area you have around you and so on, enforcing the primary gameplay loop and the other way around. So when they are this absorbed in the game, you just have to make sure that the game is centered around whatever historical message you want to get across, essentially.
You mentioned an interesting point, Frederik, about the learning and educational perspective as well. And when you've used it in learning programs, is the process there different, or is it essentially the same thing you seek to do?
The gameplay loop theory is essentially the same. That we focus on the primary gameplay loop, and then we try to build everything up from there. But I think, based on my experience so far, that in an educational setting, in an educational setting, you need slightly more structure.
Right.
Not that it has to be linear, but you need to take slightly more control, because you want to make sure that a very specific point is conveyed, whatever that be. So if we're talking a seasonal event, for instance, then I would argue that as long as the guests have a great time, they are definitely going to pick up on something.
Yeah, true.
And it might not be the very specific detail that you want them to pick up on, but they're definitely going to come away having learned something.
Yeah. And
that, to my mind, is fine. And then, kids have the internet these days, so if they're interested, they will learn on their own, essentially.
Yeah.
But in an educational setting, when you want them to learn something specific, you might need slightly more structure. But I think then the trick is to make sure that within the structure, they have as much freedom of choice as possible. The one thing that we've done so far was we essentially, the king is dead. You have to choose a new king. You have that power. You are the richest people in the country. You are gathered in the ministry, I suppose you would call it, the ministry. And you have the power to choose the next king. So within this very limited structure, they had total freedom of choice. We presented them with 3 candidates, and we divided them into 5 different sort of noble houses, groups, essentially, each given their own their own agency based on the family history, right? So depending on what type of family they were from, what they made their money on, their religious, whether they were Catholics or Protestants and so on, that would all inform what kind of king they wanted for themselves. And the point we wanted to get across was just how powerful this very small group of people were, and that they were not necessarily meant to choose the best king for the country, but the best king for them. And so within the limited structure, they had total freedom to do as they pleased. And some very, very interesting perspectives came out of that. Essentially, we ended up, one time we essentially ended up making it, going from this, what's that called? From a monarchy where the next king is chosen to a monarchy where the next king is born, because he's the son of the...
That's an interesting element of negotiation as well. You're putting into a group of how old were they? Which age group were they?
They were late teenagers. I think they were 17,
right.
18.
Yeah.
So,
So used to expressing their opinions, but suddenly have to do it within a very, in a way, a narrow space and a very defined space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's really interesting is that they in the different sessions, different narratives will appear, because as you say, the negotiation part is quite a hefty bit of it. That's sort of the main gameplay loop, is to negotiate with each other, and depending on who they choose to negotiate with, and what, again, we give the group a list of criteria or a list of things they want to accomplish. But they decide the priority. They decide where can we make concessions and where are we going to stand firm. So, and then of course the kings, they also negotiate with the kings through one of our characters, who they can come to this character and they can say, well, we would like to offer this, but then we would like the king to offer us this instead. And then it's up to that character to sort of be the king. So you'll say something like, all right, that's fine, I'll wait a bit, and then you come back with the answer, right? So it also gives us quite a bit of freedom. And I think, as I said, when it really works is when you have them create their own narrative. So some of them at one point felt that they were being backstabbed by another group, and then because the other group decided to negotiate with them and another group at the same time, which the first group apparently hadn't thought that you could do. So when they felt backstabbed, they then decided to freeze that group out, and they spent the rest of the session essentially just trying to badmouth the other group, which, as long as it's all within the spirit of the game, is fine, because that means they're engaging and creating their own small narratives within the experience. And that's really when I think that you have the strength of this way of this approach, is when the guest can do that.
Yeah. And you're giving them a very specific learning outcome, and at the same time an opportunity of really going in all sorts of directions and taking that with them. Yeah, exactly. That's great. It's like looking at a bit sort of at this concept from a broader perspective. Basically you could pick and choose any kind of historical period, character, concept, situation, event, and create a game or a live interpretation experience out of this, couldn't you? There's not really any limits when it comes to that, is there? You see?
No, definitely not. You could create whatever historic period you want, whatever character, whatever story you want to tell, because that's also an important part. Essentially, this is a way of telling stories, right? Where the guests just have a very, very active role in telling the story themselves. So you could choose whatever you want. I will say, I think it's better suited for small events like a winter break or something like that.
Yeah.
Simply because it does require a certain amount of actors on site or
resources.
Exactly. So on. And also it's just
there is a bit of a setup behind it all, isn't it?
There's a bit of a setup to it. So you would definitely, I'd say you'd be better off designing it as an experience. But I will also say that, in my mind at least, this is still unexplored territory. And I'm sure you could take the concept behind it still and use that in your daily, sort of daily office at the museum. You would just need to restructure it a bit, but the principle of focusing on your core gameplay loop and so on, I think that could be used in any museum setting.
It's interesting because really you can use this in almost any form of interpretation, can't you? Whether it be your digital interpretation, online interpretation, or it be on-site live interpretation, or it be in participation directly. There seems to be elements you can kind of pick in almost any kind of interpretation you're doing at a historical site.
Yeah, I think the main strength lies in that it gives the visitors a certain amount of agency and, as you said, choice and freedom, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah.
And to that end, you can use this approach or this theory, whatever you want to call it, to make all sorts of things. So yes, I would say that it can be used in any setting whatsoever. Just from a historic perspective, it's quite interesting that when sort of, at least in Scandinavia, when people first started doing this sort of live interpreting, we would call it, which was in like the late 1800s, they would use elements from the sort of the entertainment industry of the time. So they used a lot of wax figures because, panopticons and so on were all the rage, and they would use tableaus and so on. And of course, they would use actors and from the theatrical world. So I think, in a sense, this is just taking the next logical step, which is using today's entertainment industry, where gaming, of course, is, without comparison, the largest industry. Gaming currently is outselling movies and music combined.
True.
And outselling them by far. So it's the next logical step.
That's interesting, because that was actually my next question, because it sounds as if you're seeing this as a kind of natural development of interpretation and storytelling. And it's something that we'll probably see more and more, and it will develop into all sorts of new things.
I hope so. That's because yes, I think this is. I think the next natural step is for the guests to take a more active role in their museum's experience in general. And I think especially in live interpretation, there's a tendency for the experience to become quite passive.
Yeah, true.
Which is a shame. And I think this way of approach is a great way to make it a more active experience, and a more sort of, I was about to call it true active, because I think that sometimes when we want to make it active, then we'll have very, very limited influence for the, like, say that,
or the outcome has already been given somehow, no matter how much you participate. Yeah,
exactly.
Whereas this really forces you to participate, because if you don't participate, you don't have an experience.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And to that point, when we were sort of planning this, one of our reenactors posed a very great question, which was, seems that what you're saying is that this is based on game theory. And I said, yes, of course it is. Then he said, good. So just one question: what happens if people don't want to play the game? Which was a really great question that I actually must admit I haven't considered. The answer is, of course, that in your marketing and so on, you have to make sure that people understand what they're walking into.
Yeah.
To the extent that you get people in who want to participate. But if we go back to the idea of gauging the guests, in your first 5 to 10 seconds, sometimes some of the guests that came, they were really just walking around doing a checklist, right? They found all the characters, they would ask them the questions, they would be told the task would be posed to them, they would solve the task, they would move on. They weren't really engaging with the story or the game, so to speak. But that's also fine. If that's what they want, then that's what you give them. And then sometimes you get the brilliant experiences where a 10-year-old girl just marches in ahead of her family and starts concocting this brilliant story of why she's here, and stuff she just made up. Because the thing is, at least there was an element of secrecy to it. If the guest is engaging with the secrecy of it, then we do, and we pour it on thick. But if the guest is just, walks in and shows you the list they have to make and so on, that's fine. That's just where we take it from. But when you have engaging with the secrecy, that's when you got the truly brilliant experience, both for me as an interpreter, but definitely also, I believe, for the guests.
Oh, it's going to be so interesting to see where this is developing in the future, isn't it? For a heritage site, and for I guess any kind of cultural and historic site, really, because you can really use it anywhere and in so many different contexts. It's
definitely
very exciting. Frederik, thank you so much. It's been brilliant talking to you.